Hi. Hi. It's so nice to see you all. Thank you so much for inviting me to share a few words and to engage in conversation. I specifically want to thank Rich for the invitation to join you all for your coffee chat this late morning after services, following up the Zoom conversation that we did maybe a month or two ago. And specifically also want to thank my dear and oldest friend Elizabeth for making the connection to the Paulist Center. I can't believe we met when we were 3 years old and somehow we're still friends, despite being separated by many thousands of kilometers and oceans and everything else. Let's see. In light of the fact that many Americans, maybe even including some of you here in this room, are gearing up for what I could only describe as a very bizarre American tradition of staring at a screen and watching small groups of virile young men go at each other on a field in order to establish their dominance and probably cause some serious brain damage, I thought I would bring to you a story of small groups of young men, also in uniform, also trying to annihilate each other and cause severe brain damage. And that is the conflict that is currently taking place in the Middle East. And what I would like to do is hopefully engage in conversation as much as possible. I'll say a few quick words about myself, just so you understand where I'm coming from and how I got into this thing of traveling around the world and speaking to communities and teaching. I want to share a few brief thoughts about the conflict, hopefully to contextualize a little bit of sort of my personal experience and how I'm functioning, how I'm dealing with the conflict that is playing out in my backyard. And then as quickly as possible, I would like to open it up to conversation, comments, questions, whatever have you, whatever interests you. I'm fairly certain that this is a pretty intelligent community. Feel free to prove me wrong. But I'm guessing that you know where to find a lot of kind of the basic information if you're not already being bombarded by it on a fairly daily basis in terms of the details and some of the facts, although I understand understanding facts is a hard thing to do these days in many media circles. So I would, if you have questions, basic, simple questions, feel free to ask them, but I'm probably going to sort of steer towards the more contextual and analytical and hopefully even a little inspirational and how to look at this particular evolution of the conflict that has been going on for a long time. So as you can hear from my very thick Middle Eastern accent, I am not originally from Jerusalem. I grew up in New Hampshire, where Elizabeth and I became fast friends at the age of 3. I was born into a Jewish family, but as some of you might be well aware, New Hampshire is not really known for its vibrant Jewish community. And so I was a bit of a late bloomer, really only experiencing really what Jewish community could feel like after I went to university and then lived in Boston. So this was actually my last stomping ground before I decided to go explore further afield. And I lived here for a number of years, got very engaged with the Jewish community of Boston and Somerville and Brookline. And that was the first time that I really felt a sense of Jewish identity come alive. And one of the things I quickly picked up on is that many of the Jews around me who were already deep into a sense of Jewish identity and Jewish life was an Israel experience, right? Going to the Holy Land to figure out sort of how history connects, how the land connects, and I had never done that. And so I decided at a certain point in time that it was my turn. And so I went to Israel. And I thought I'd stay for a few months, travel around, learn Hebrew, make some friends, and I'm still there almost 30 years later. So like I'm sure many of you have heard other similar stories, the unexpected often becomes the expected in the Holy Land. People are deeply affected by what exists there, the potential there, the meaning there, and that got me stuck for all of the right reasons. And so for a number of years, as I realized that Jerusalem was becoming my home, I sort of dove into the deep end of the Jewish world and started to study and started to experience and engage to really find out what did it mean, not just to live in intense and full Jewish life, but also to sort of experience it in the place where it may very well have evolved, right? In the Holy Land, right? Where we see the biblical texts come alive, the geography is very critical to the story, and being in that, certainly in that sacred city, that sacred space, where we have many physical hints that take us back to the earliest parts of our narratives. And so as I did that, I became fully surrounded by this amazing and rich Jewish experience. I ended up studying Talmud for many years. I became a Talmud teacher. I then opened up my own Jewish learning facility, which I ran for 8 years. And I lived in this wonderful Jewish bubble that exists in Jerusalem, unlike almost anywhere else on earth. And it didn't take me too long to realize that it was, in fact, a bubble, and that I probably should get out of that bubble. Largely because, as you know well, but it took me some while to catch on, there are many populations that feel at home in Jerusalem and in the Holy Land. Many religions, many ethnic identities, many political identities. And so as I started to carefully edge my way beyond this beautiful Jewish world that I inhabited, I recognized that there was so much more that I sort of owed myself and owed the land in order to learn and incorporate into my story. It wasn't really fair for me to just live this kind of beautiful Jewish narrative without recognizing everything else going on around me. And of course, that is part of the nature of why life in the Middle East is so unbelievably screwed up. Because we are masters of narrative, we are masters of tribal identity, and we're not really good at recognizing or making space for the other in that world of, here I am, the birthplace of my story, right? My ancestors lived here, my prophets lived here, God lived here. And so it's very hard to open yourself up to that world. And as I did so, I found myself being enriched by this world of now kind of multi-narrative, multi-identity, multi-faith. And so a lot of the teaching that I was doing in this beautiful Jewish world of mine had to evolve as well. And so I've spent much of the last, I would say, 15 to 20 years predominantly focused on teaching history, narrative, faith, geopolitics in a very confusing world of many narratives, many identities. I teach in Israeli communities, I teach in Palestinian communities. I teach in Israel and I teach in Palestine. I work with many Palestinian colleagues, both Christians and Muslim, as well as many Jewish colleagues. And I spend a lot of my time now traveling around the world, serving as scholar in residence in different communities. I work with universities, I work with seminaries. Worth to mention, since I'm at the Paulist Center, spend a lot of my time teaching Catholic priests and nuns and seminary students who come from around the world to the Holy Land in order to learn a little bit more deeply about their identity and, of course, what's going on. I think that's enough about me for now, just to understand the baggage that I bring to education and to talking about some of these themes. What I would like to do now is just share 3 hopefully brief thoughts. I am a teacher and I'm Jewish, so that 2 strikes against me on the brief front. But I will do my best to keep them brief. Just a couple of thoughts about this thing that we're now, I guess we're calling the Israel-Hamas War. And hopefully sort of plant a few seeds in your minds about things that interest you, things that are frustrating you, things that you're curious about, so that we can then open it up to conversation. And as Rich said, if people feel the need or have to go for whatever reason, please don't be shy. I want this to be as informal as possible. So the first thing I'll share is this, that despite the obvious tragedies and traumas that have overwhelmed my people, my friends, my neighbors, my colleagues, right? These 2 nations of Israelis and Palestinians, since October 7th, it is very important to not dwell on October 7th too much. And I say that with tremendous pain because obviously as a Jew, my life, my world, my country was turned upside down on October 7th, the most devastating and disastrous day since the Holocaust in World War II. But why do I say not to dwell on October 7th? Because it is far too convenient for us to look at that moment in time and simply point fingers. Who started it, right? Why did that happen then? What was the response? And then what's been happening and playing out since then? While obviously that is a critical part of any conflict conversation, that is not the essence of what is going on here. As I'm sure you all know well, this is a conflict that was not born on October 7th, 2023, right? It has a deep and very complicated history to it. And in order to understand what happened on October 7th and everything that came after that, we owe it to ourselves to try to learn about what happened before, which is a very ominous task, because this conflict can easily date back to somewhere in either the late 19th century, early 20th century. All scholars were all in disagreement over when it actually starts, but it's definitely been going on for about 100 years. And so when we look at a conflict on the screens in our living rooms, and we think of it in terms of Israel, the modern nation state, versus Hamas, an organization that was born maybe in the 70s, 1980s, out of a movement that predates that, that's simply not old enough to understand the story. As I hinted at before, we are peoples of narrative, right? We don't exist very well on a plane where we can sort of just point a few years ago to where we come from or why we are. We go back thousands of years. We're constantly trying to dig our stories out of the ground. And so understanding the breadth and the depth of those narratives. What does it mean to be a Palestinian? What does it mean to be an Israeli? What does it mean to be a Jew and a Christian and a Muslim in the Holy Land? Is so much more important, and I think will contribute more to the conversation about moving past this conflict, creating some sort of exit ramp, right? Whether or not we're going to have peace, I don't know. Whether or not we're going to be even able to declare a ceasefire, I don't know. But we definitely need an exit ramp. This cannot simply go on. Clearly, it is unsustainable, right? Jews are dying, Christians are dying, Muslims are dying at an astounding rate. And that obviously needs to stop. I think as people of faith, we want to try to incorporate this sense of hope, right? That something good maybe can come out of that. We cannot do that without truly understanding who these people are, what they want, right? So for a Jewish Israeli, for example, to turn to Hamas and say, this war happened because of what you perpetrated on October 7th. Right? This incursion across the border from the Gaza Strip into the state of Israel, the massacre of the young people on the beach who were at the music festival, the annihilation of many of the communities, the agricultural communities that surround the Gaza Strip, that was an awful, tragic moment. But we need to understand, who is Hamas? Where are they coming from? What about the fact that Israel had a very serious political relationship with Hamas for many, many years now? The fact that with the sort of geostrategic implications of Iran's influence in my neighborhood, meaning the corner of the Middle East that is Israel-Palestine, that relationship of Iran supporting Hamas as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood that came to be in the 1980s and eventually took over control of the Gaza Strip following the Palestinian elections in 2006, as that relationship was slowly coming apart, meaning Iran supporting Hamas, Israel essentially stepped in and decided to help reframe the relationship in order to keep Hamas viable. Does that mean that Israel or I as a Jew am responsible for what Hamas did on October 7th? No, of course not. What it means is that Israel needs to take a hard look at why we wanted to sustain Hamas. It's not because we agreed with their charter. It's not because we agreed with some of their actions. but perhaps for political or strategic reasons, right? Specifically, if you know anything about the government of Israel today, you'll know that we are leaning further and further to the right, right? One might even call it ultra-extremist. It is the far most extreme government Israel has seen since its inception in 1948. But this idea of propping up Hamas, of roping in Qatar to fund Hamas in place of Iran, because that Irani relationship was too troubling to Israel, deciding not to militarily challenge Hamas, which Israel clearly can and has been able to do since the beginning of time, right? So those decisions were being made because of lots of things going on behind the scenes. We don't have time to go into everything, but obviously I'm planting the seeds. Feel free to ask the question. But this is something, just one example, right, of trying to understand why Hamas was still there, why they were able to establish themselves as a military power, maybe not a superpower, but certainly as a military power. They, as now is becoming more and more known to the world, have created an entire network of underground tunnels with military infrastructure underneath and including the civil infrastructure of the Gaza Strip, right? Such that the war, as it's playing out right now, where at least on October 7th, right, Israel may have had a good reason, a justification for responding to Hamas. Ever since October 7th, I think many of us can agree that Israel has now become a pariah in the world, almost entirely isolated, even including increasingly by factions within the United States, because the response was so overwhelming, perhaps is now seen as bordering on genocide, right? As we witnessed in the recent trial in the International Court of Justice in The Hague. So I'm just, again, sort of giving an example of how looking at October 7th as just, sort of an outbreak of violence is barely even scratching the surface of the critical approach to understanding all of the different events that come up to that, right? Quickly, from a Palestinian perspective, if we look at October 7th, right, as the ultimate expression of responding to oppression, right, as most Palestinians see it today. There was recently a poll taken amongst Palestinians in the West Bank, not in the Gaza Strip, but in the West Bank. 97% of the respondees of Palestinian Muslims and Christians in the West Bank did not oppose the actions of Hamas on October 7th. Now, that doesn't mean that they know exactly what happened, right? And here, just like in America, we all know that media plays a really important role in how things get portrayed. Palestinians don't really see or hear through their media sources what took place on October 7th, other than the fact that it was an incursion against the oppressor, the occupier. In the same way that Israeli Jews generally are not seeing the more than 23,537, as of this morning, dead Palestinians as a result of the Israeli military incursion. Right? We simply aren't seeing them on our screens because, as I shared with you, we're a people of narrative. Other people's dead doesn't fit our narrative. And so when Palestinians see Hamas standing up for Palestinian identity and nationalism and freedom cross the border, there is almost an eruption of pride and joy. Not because they necessarily want to support, torture and massacre and rape, but because they feel that this is what needs to happen in order for Palestinians to assert their presence in the land. Take into consideration that for now decades, the Palestinians have been led by what has become an entirely ineffective political structure known as the Palestinian Authority. This is according to Palestinian opinion polls, not according to me. They have no faith in their political leadership. It is utterly corrupt. Not so different than Israel's, as a matter of fact. The point being is that if we look a little bit further into the past, again, just as a hint, we can understand how Hamas became a very relevant player for Palestinian national identity. Because as an Islamist organization, they were born not out of violence against the Israeli occupier, but as a way of rooting out evil and corruption and mismanagement in their own Palestinian midst, right? And so there's nuance to all of these things. Things are not always as clear as they seem. Again, these are just examples. We could go on forever, I'm not going to. But I just wanted to point out that we often get stuck pointing the finger at who started it on October 7th. That is not, from an educator and a historian perspective, that is not relevant. We need to deal with the issues of what happened on October 7th, but we all need to be much better educated about what happened in 2007, what happened in 1967, what happened in 1948, what happened in 1917. I mean, you name it. There's always a date, there's always a moment, and there's something that we need to understand. So that was sort of my first thing. This isn't as brief as you thought it was going to be, was it? So that first thing is us truly understanding the nuance of our narratives and the history that leads us to these issues, because by better understanding the people and what's going on in those communities and in their heads, we can try to come up with potential solutions. We can respond to those things that are really troubling people that lead to outbreaks of violence like we're witnessing now. And which is just causing undue tragedy in my neck of the woods. And that leads me to the second thing. And that is that there is not enough of a spotlight being shined? Okay, good. Sometimes English fails me. There's not enough of a spotlight on the work that is being done in Israel, in Palestine, in Israel-Palestine, meaning together, by simple humans on the ground who do not have any faith in conflict, who do not believe in violence, and they don't think that this is going to achieve any of their dreams, their aspirations, be it faith-based, be it political, doesn't matter. And so there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of amazing organizations and community initiatives that are probably not flashing across your TV screens on a regular basis. But it's really important to know that they exist. It's one of the reasons why Rich asked me to highlight one particular organization out of a list of, I think, about 15 or 20 that I had circulated following the first talk that I led on Zoom, because these are the stories that not only are potentially going to provide a path forward beyond violence, but hopefully these are the same stories that are going to give people like you, like me, hope and inspiration that this can be solved. Because once again, it's far too easy to look at something like October 7th and think, this is just going to go on forever, right? It's just another cycle in an unending world of conflict and violence. But that's not true. It's not the case. And I'm very, very thankful that I can say that I can prove it because I live it. As an educator, I am blessed to be surrounded by these people and be inspired by them, and often get to work with them in all kinds of different civic initiatives, be it cross-border environmental activism, right? The fact that the Holy Land doesn't really give a crap if you're Palestinian or you're Israeli or what side of the hill you live on. If sewage is flowing through the rivers, it's going to affect us all. Right? So there are organizations where Palestinians and Israelis work together in order to solve basic, simple day-to-day issues. If we can sit in a room together and talk about water resource management, why can't we talk about other things, right? We build trust, we build relationships, and things happen. Just before I flew to America, which is about 3 weeks now already, I participated in an annual tradition that is sponsored by yet another of these amazing organizations, led by Jewish religious clergy, where we go out into Palestinian agricultural fields and stand in solidarity with Palestinian farmers in order to either plant olive trees or harvest olive trees. We do it twice a year. Why do we do that? Because, once again, probably not flashing across your screens, is the chaos that is now erupting between the Israeli settler communities in the West Bank and their Palestinian neighbors, right? Because so much of our attention is being drawn over to that teeny little strip of land known as the Gaza Strip, we are not focusing enough on what is evolving in the West Bank, and it has become even more untenable than on an average day. And so with the violence increasing between those communities, some of us have said, we don't stand for it. So we're simply going to go out into the fields and provide some strange form of buffer. Hopefully, if an angry Jew sees me wearing a kippah on my head, planting an olive tree, they won't attack me. Turns out that's a pretty faulty assumption, because I've had my butt handed to me on a number of occasions, but nonetheless, it's really important to be able to stand there in solidarity and say, I don't have to agree with your political aspirations or anything else, but you're my neighbor, and we all like trees, right? We all need to eat, we all need olive oil. If you've been to the Middle East, nothing works without olive oil. And that's just another example. The last one I'll give, because it's relevant to, I believe, what went out in the newsletter, is an organization that I am deeply involved with called the Interfaith Encounter Association, where we simply try to look beyond our deeply entrenched political identities and focus more on the fact that as people of faith, obviously not everybody in the Holy Land is a believer, but certainly there are a lot of us, and as people of faith, it is remarkable for any remotely educated human being how intertwined our faith narratives are, right? We are not telling different stories. It's the same God. It's many of the same prophets, a lot of the same laws, certainly for the Muslims and the Jews. And so to be able to come together and study text and to live out our religious lives, right, as partners, as neighbors, once again, it builds relationships, it builds trust, and we're able to then take that to the obvious end, which is dealing with some of the more deeply seated challenges like politics, borders, independence, etc. And so there is a tremendous amount of hope that should be gleaned from what's going on in the Holy Land right now, even if you're not hearing about it enough, right? Just know that it's there and that you can access it through maybe a little bit of extra Googling, or now that you have a friend named Jared who lives in Jerusalem, you can contact me and I'll tell you all about it. One last thing. And then I'll sort of close off. I hope I haven't used up too much time. And then hopefully I want to hear from you a little bit. And that is certainly as a religious Jew, one who has constantly been struggling in my own faith identity, but nonetheless living in Jerusalem, I just can't help ignore the fact, right, that I'm surrounded by the beauty, the potential beauty of faith. I look to my textual tradition for inspiration. And so I wanted to just share one thought with you that is something that might also connect, but hopefully maybe also inspire you to action. Upstairs in the reading this morning from the Gospels, right, the passage began upon leaving the synagogue, right? Something that Jesus probably did very, very frequently, not only leaving the synagogue, but also going into the synagogue. And unlike in most Jewish communities around the world today, the synagogue back then was not a house of prayer. It was a house of learning, specifically a house of gathering. That's what the word synagogue means in Greek. But they were gathering specifically to learn. What are they learning? They're learning the teachings of God, right? What we call Torah in Hebrew, the teaching. And so learning those teachings is not just about reading text, but also engaging with those texts. Studying them, peeling away the layers, encountering each other over text, right? Engaging in debate and discussion over what the texts mean. What does God want from us? What are we supposed to do with these words? The core of that textual debate, of that textual tradition, of course, comes to us from what we call the 10 sayings, right? You might know it as the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are presented to Moses and the people of Israel in this week's reading of the Torah in Jewish communities around the world. Okay? So I just wanted to link that up. If you were to go to any Jewish synagogue around the world yesterday, of course, the Jewish Sabbath, you would hear the reading of the 10 Commandments. But I don't really want to focus on that, because everybody knows that story, at least hopefully you do. But I want to focus on something that happens right before the 10 sayings are offered to Moses on top of Mount Sinai. In Exodus chapter 18, verse 21, we read right before Moses ascends Mount Sinai that he is given an instruction that you shall go out and seek among the people of valor, fearers of God, people of truth, who abhor ill-gotten gains, and you shall appoint them to be ministers/leaders of the thousands, ministers of the hundreds, ministers of the 50s, ministers of the 10s. Right? What is Moses essentially being told? He needs to delegate. This is one of the most important moments in the entirety of the Torah. He cannot facilitate the teaching of the children of Israel all by himself, especially not as it's going to become a very legal tradition with a lot of punishments, right? And so in order to be able to inspire and teach and administer the guidelines that are going to become the identity of the Israelite people, Moses needs to find other people who are committed to the cause, who aren't in it for themselves, for ego, for ill-gotten gains, and they're going to be delegated on these sort of like this ladder of authority, right, over the thousands, the hundreds, the 50s, and the 10s. Who gives Moses this instruction? Anybody know? Not God. This instruction is not coming from God. This instruction is coming from Jethro. Who is Jethro?
Father-in-law.
It's his father-in-law. But more importantly, Jethro is the high priest of Midian, one of the other tribes out there in the wilderness, right? Not part of the children of Israel, but through marriage, Moses now has a relationship with Jethro. Okay? Why is this relevant? In the Jewish tradition, we first of all look at Jethro's name, right? In Hebrew, Yitro, coming from the Hebrew word yeter. Yeter means an addition, something beyond, right? Something you're contributing to. And the understanding is that Jethro is providing the Israelite people with a critical addition to this world of commandedness, of chosenness, if you will, right, as the Jews phrase it. So standing at the foot of Mount Sinai, receiving the teaching of God is irrelevant without this outside influence of Jethro, right, this bonus coming into the mix and telling Moses, you don't get it. Listen to me. I'm going to give you some wisdom. And this is how you're going to make it work. And so I would simply like to end on that note of saying that I think all of us, but certainly I'll speak for myself, for the Jewish world, we can't do this alone. We are clearly failing. Even if you believe in some sort of response to annihilation or to being challenged or to being killed, I think we can clearly look at this war and say that Israel is not getting it right. We might be trying, but I think we're failing. More and more Israelis are standing up and saying, we're not getting it right. We're fumbling. We want to punish Hamas, but we don't want to annihilate the Palestinian people. We want to rescue our hostages, but we don't want to kill all of our own children, i.e. the soldiers of Israel, along the way. We need help from the outside. We need external wisdom. And this is where you come in. You all know that Israel's most important ally is the United States of America, to the tune of about $3.8 billion a year. Whether or not you agree with that financial support, What it means is that America has a tremendous influence on what happens in Israel and in Palestine. And so whatever we end up discussing today, I just want you to take home with you this idea that we need more Jethros. We need people who don't necessarily consider themselves part of the children of Israel, and maybe at least not in the Jewish sense of the word, to come in from the outside and say, we might have some wisdom to offer you, right? Different ways to think, creative ways to think. And so I want to encourage people to get involved, even if it just means making a phone call to your representative and saying, I'm not happy with the way things are going. America has a voice, use it, right? But then not forgetting the first two steps I mentioned, which is understand the history of the conflict so that you don't fall trapped to blaming, right, who started October 7th. And then the second thing is to know that there's already good work being done on the ground, which you can simply become a part of. You don't have to start anything. Okay? Please be my Jethro. Questions, comments? Thanks. Thank you.